So here we are. I am Mary Rohde. I am the Architecture Transportation Reviews Manager and National Register Reviews Manager at the Ohio State Historic Preservation Office at the Ohio History Connection. In our audience tonight is also Abby Marshall. She is a National Register Reviews Manager as well. Joining in presentation with me tonight are Wendy Hodge-Naylor and Diana Wellman of Naylor Wellman LLC, who prepared this boundary crease amendment. A little bit about the Historic Preservation Office. We are a division of the Ohio History Connection here in Columbus, Ohio. More specifically, the State Historic Preservation Office identifies historic places in Ohio, nominates properties to the National Register of Historic Places, reviews federally assisted projects for a fix on historic, architectural, and archaeological resources in Ohio, facilitates federal and state preservation tax credit applications, consults on the conservation of older buildings and sites, and offers educational programs and publications. The SHPA program we are discussing today, of course, is the National Register. What is the National Register of Historic Places? It is the official list of properties worthy of preservation for their significance in Ohio history in the areas of archaeology, architecture, engineering, and culture. The National Register was created by the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 as amended, and it set up the federal-state partnership to administer the National Register program. The main objective of the National Register is to recognize and honor significant historic properties at the national, state, and local levels. Ohio ranks third in the nation with the number of National Register listings, with 4,100 total listings. That's a culmination of both individual listings and historic districts, amassing over 50,000 properties. What makes a property eligible for the National Register? And once I tell you the answer, of course, there are some exceptions to the rules, and some property evaluations can sometimes get a little nuanced. So we'll save all of those discussions for another day. And today, what we need to focus on are the three basic ingredients. The first ingredient is age. The property must be at least 50 years of age or older. The second ingredient is significance. Or why the property is important in history. And significance is categorized in at least one of four National Register criteria. A property's place in broader history. B, association with important people. C, architectural design. And D, information potential. The third ingredient is integrity, and this captures the idea of place-based history. The nominated property must retain the historic characteristics to convey the significance. The 7 aspects of integrity are location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, feeling, and association. These help us decide if the property looks like it did during the period of significance. Eligible properties can be single buildings, they can be sites, they can be structures, or even objects. Or a historic property can be a collective of these, making up a historic district, like the proposed boundary increase presented here today. Historic districts contain a significant concentration, linkage, or continuity of sites, buildings, structures, or objects, united historically or aesthetically by plan or physical development. When establishing a historic district, the history and architectural character is explained through the National Register criteria, that A, B, C, or D, the areas of significance, or the why it's important, and the period of significance, or the when it is important. There are contributing and non-contributing properties within a historic district. Contributing properties are built during the historic time period associated with the district. They add to the historic district in its historic and architectural significance and character of the district, where non-contributing properties are usually not built within the historic time period, or they have been built in the historic time period, but they've been so altered that they no longer convey the historic appearance or associations. So essentially, they no longer help us tell the story. Hudson is no stranger to establishing a historic district or preservation. This slide shows the existing National Register Historic District boundaries and the historic district boundary increase that we're talking about today. So the blue dashed line with the hash marks is the Western Reserve Academy Historic District. The solid red line towards the bottom of the screen is the 1973 original historic district boundary. And the aqua dashed line at the edges of everywhere is the 1989 boundary increase. The purple dashed line at the lower right is the proposed 2021 boundary increase that we're talking about today. So the existing historic districts are listed under criterions A and C in the areas of significance for community planning and development and architecture. So that's the Y. And the when is the period of significance of 1806 to 1940. Here is a zoomed in image of the proposed boundary increase along Elm and Roslyn. What you are seeing is the boundary increase, the purple dashed line, abutted to the 1989 aqua dashed line. The dark shaded buildings are non-contributing buildings to the historic district, and the non-shaded are contributing buildings. The boundary increase will add 82 newly contributing buildings, those 44 shown here in the purple boundary, plus another 38 buildings scattered throughout the existing historic district, resulting in a total of 412 contributing buildings within the combined boundaries. So the purpose of this amendment is to extend the period of significance to 1963 from 1940 under the already established criterions A and C in the areas of significance of community planning and development and for architecture. So Wendy and Diana are going to dig a little deeper into the supporting information explaining why 1963 is a significant end date and how these buildings contribute to these areas of significance. But first, let's take a look at the basic information about the National Register program. So the National Register of Historic Places, first and foremost, offers a sense of pride by honoring and recognizing those properties worthy of preservation for their historic and architectural significance. And because of this, listing can be a very important planning and education tool. When properties within a community are recognized in the National Register, property owners, federal, state, and local decision makers know what properties are significant and can use that information to make informed community project decisions, and sometimes using the value of historic preservation through local programming, creating walking tours, having special events, etc. Individual properties and historic districts listed in the National Register are also given special consideration in the planning of federal and state projects through Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. Income producing buildings, owners, I should say, can take advantage of historic rehabilitation tax credits, and getting listed in the National Register is the first step in that process. And there may even be federal grant assistance available to those properties that are listed. The National Register does not affect property owners' rights. Listing in the National Register places neither restrictions nor requirements on a private property owner. The property owner may do with the property as they wish, with a big asterisk. And that asterisk is they can do what they wish with their property within the framework of local laws or local ordinances. The National Register listing should not be confused with a community's local ordinance that may have been set up for a design review. The National Register may be the impetus for initiating those local guidelines, but they are not a direct result of the NR listing. And finally, a little bit about the NR process. Nominations are made through the State Historic Preservation Office. Anybody can prepare a National Register nomination, it does not have to be the owner of the property or even a preservation professional. It's also important to note that all property owners are notified and given the opportunity to comment on the nomination before it is actually listed in the National Register. The process has 3 parts. Proposed nominations are reviewed by State Historic Preservation Office staff for completeness, and then they are presented to the State Review Board. In Ohio, it's the Ohio Historic Site Preservation Advisory Board. And after their review, they will make a recommendation to the SHPO to either send the nomination on to the National Park Service, or it may need a little extra work. So when the final step is sending the nomination to the National Park Service for their final review and decision, which is getting listed in the National Register of Historic Places. There are 3 specific places in the process for notifications. The first is usually 60 to 30 days prior to the State Review Board meeting. The second is when the nomination is sent to the National Park Service for review. And the third is when the nomination is listed in the National Register. So that number 1, that 60 to 30 days, that's what we're doing right now. And since there are more than 50 property owners involved in this historic district, we issued a legal notice and are having this public meeting to inform the public and allow for opportunities for support comments or even objections. It would take a majority of the private property owners to object for the National Register nomination to not be listed. The nomination will still go through the review process and would still be sent to the National Park Service, even if there is that objection. However, the district or boundary increase would not be listed in the National Register. It becomes what's called a determination of eligibility. And that is important mostly because that DOE, or that determination of eligibility, still triggers the Section 106 review process. And those properties will be afforded that extra consideration of effects. However, that does mean that property owners cannot take advantage of tax credits, or that area may not be eligible for federal grant assistance. Where are we in this process? We are currently prepping for the December 3rd State Review Board meeting and hosting this public meeting to inform property owners and the public and ask for support comments or objections. The December 3rd meeting will be a hybrid. The State Review Board members are required to meet in person to form a quorum and make their votes on the proposed nominations per Ohio's open meeting laws. Audience members are requested to attend the meeting via Zoom and will be able to hear and see the board conduct their business, much like we're doing right now. And they will be able to make public comment and or respond to any questions that are asked. So if you have any support comments or objection comments after tonight's meeting, please send correspondence to Bert Logan, our State Historic Preservation Officer, at the address listed on the screen. And here is your time, your first set aside time for any questions about anything I presented right now. If you have any questions not necessarily pertaining to this meeting and want to reach out to me afterwards, there's my email. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen and give a little pause here for people to type questions into the question and answer, and allow Wendy and Diana to post their or start sharing their screen.
That's my cue. Okay.
That's your cue, Wendy.
We have no questions at this time.
All right. Did I successfully screen share?
Everything's great.
You can hear me. We did it. We've had 2 successful segues. That's really good for this evening. Well, first of all, Diana and I would really like to thank the State Historic Preservation Office, especially Mary, who was the reviewer on this project, Barb, Tina, and Abby. Without their hard work on these nominations, we just couldn't begin to do what we do. There's an amazing amount of detail that goes on behind the scenes, so I wanted to do a special thank you to them for all the time that they've put into helping us and guiding us on this district. As well, the city of Hudson has been a pleasure to work with. It's very exciting to see a neighborhood like Elm and Roslyn reach out and take the initiative and really want to see their neighborhood listed on the National Register. So that's an exciting thing for us to participate in as well. So Mary had put up this map. I'll just review it really quickly. As you can see, the shaded green portion is the existing Hudson Historic District. Hudson has an amazing number of properties already listed on the National Register. That existing Hudson Historic District is the green. It wraps around the blue portion, which is the Western Reserve, the WRA Historic District. The three buildings that are starred are the Corbusier House, the Porter House, and of course the Gray Schooler Isant House on College Street, which are individually listed. And then really the focus of this evening is the purple section, which is Elm and Roslyn down in that lower right-hand corner. Just to give you some perspective on how many properties you really do have listed in Hudson. So as part of the proposed Hudson Historic District boundary increase, which is what we're focusing on tonight, one of the things we did is we increased the period of significance. Mary talked about with National Register listings, you have a designated period of significance for an individual property or for a district. In this case, we extended the district, which had ended in 1940. We extended it to 1963. And in the process of doing that, reviewed those buildings you saw in the green section, in the existing section of the Hudson Historic District, for resources dated between 1941 and 1963 that were contributing to the district. So we added 39 resources. The 1962 Hudson Square building that you see on the screen, we found a 1963 photo. It doesn't look too much different today. That's one of the buildings that has now gone from non-contributing to contributing as part of the Hudson Historic District boundary increase. But our focus has really been on Elm Street and Roslyn. That was the neighborhood that really initiated this process with the city. We have 70 resources within that area of town that were built between 1889 and 1963 on Elm and Roslyn. The types of buildings that are included, they're houses, garages, barns. We have styles and types including bungalows, Cape Cod, minimal traditional, and with predominantly colonial revival elements, which is important. I'll talk to you about that a little bit farther as we go through the significance of the district. So Mary talked about, in order to be listed on the National Register, you have to show criterion of significance for buildings that are included. So for purposes of the Hudson District, there's significance under criterion A, community planning and development, demonstrating the continuing influence of nationally recognized model town planner James Ellsworth, culminating in the formation of this early grassroots preservation organization, Hudson Heritage, in 1962, and the establishment of the Hudson Architectural and Historic Board of Review the following year in 1963. So with the boundary increases, it really gave an opportunity to memorialize the story of Hudson as being this important on Hudson Heritage and Hudson Architectural Review Board, James Ellsworth, of really institutionalizing this important preservation history very much related to Hudson. There's another area of significance under C in the area of architecture. You have a span of building styles and types, again, dominated by that colonial revival style, influence encouraged by Ellsworth, blending with that earlier New England village historic architecture of Hudson, which really maintain it as this individual, independent, ex-urban village. So we found a wonderful photo that happened to be on Elm Street, which is on the screen. You can see 112 Elm Street in the back. Pretty easy to date the photo. When we discovered it was a 1928 Ford Model A in the photo, but just a wonderful photo of what the neighborhood looked like. We're saying circa 1930. So the area of Elm and Roslyn, it is part of the Schuyler Chamberlain allotment. So this is an 1874 atlas map that shows where that Chamberlain allotment was located. You can see the downtown area of Hudson, Maine, and then Aurora traveling at the diagonal up to the right-hand corner of the page. You see that downtown, there's a grid, a denser pattern. And so Chamberlain likely saw that opportunity to subdivide that area and add to the residential grid pattern of the village to offer lots for building and development. So he purchased that acreage in 1867. He went on to record his allotment in 1875 with the county auditor. And you can see in this atlas map on the screen in 1891, you can see that that allotment has had just a very few lots sold. But it gives you an idea of the location of the allotment in relationship to the downtown. So Hudson had different eras that were addressed in the original historic district nomination, one of which was called the Railroad Prosperity and Merchant Builders period of time in Hudson, which was 1850 to 1907. Hudson was anticipating the railroad coming post-Civil War, so there was a lot of building and excitement and investment, and unfortunately the railroad never came. So there was a depression, and as a result of that in Hudson, really during the late 1800s, end of the 19th century. But Chamberlain still persevered and built his house in 1889. He had worked as a farmer, retired at the age of 68 when he subdivided his land, built this house, 1889. He was the grandson of a Hudson pioneer farmer and Revolutionary War soldier, William Chamberlain. And he was born in Hudson in 1821. So he was part of that migration from Connecticut to the Western Reserve and relatively early on in the 1820s. In 1844, he married Jane Bliss. They raised 3 children. Chamberlain lived here till he passed away in 1900, and his wife Jane followed in 1902, really still leaving a lot of vacant lots on this allotment. Again, another house was built in the allotment area during this Railroad Prosperity Merchant Building, which also had the Economic Depression era. It's kind of unusual that 2 houses were built in this area because very little building was going on in Hudson during this time. This house is circa 1893. Wilbert Lewis built this house. He was a carpenter, likely constructed it. The terracotta tile roof and the white paint scheme was something I'll talk about in a little bit, that James Ellsworth was giving free paint and red tile away. And so this was likely when that was added to this particular house in 1907. So those 2 are the oldest houses that are in the Elm-Roslyn area, and kind of begin the discussion of the boundary increase. So James Ellsworth comes back to Hudson in the early 1900s when it had fallen into this deep economic depression. He had been a huge success at the 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago, he had secured significant leaders in that exposition, including Daniel Burnham and Frederick Law Olmsted, and also himself became a leader in the model town movement. So he was a native of Hudson. He came back to Hudson, and in 1907 presented to Village Council a proposition to revitalize the village. He offered to construct plants for electric lighting, water, sewage treatment, and in return had 9 conditions: that the village continue to repair those plants, keep them operating, that they bury all the wires underground or place them at the rear of property line, that they plant elm trees along all the streets, no intoxicating beverages or beer to be sold in the, other than beer to be sold in the village, no street railways, which is really interesting when you think about that independent village concept that we'll talk about. And he also asked them to form a corporation to buy what they were calling the derelict campus of Western Reserve College at that time. So Ellsworth made a tremendous investment in Hudson. He was buying commercial and residential properties for renovation and building. He established the First National Bank of Hudson, civic organizations. He was promoting this beautification program. And again, he offered to re-roof anybody's house in red tile and white paint at no cost. And the newspaper at the time reported that in no time in Hudson history had so many houses been painted in one season. So this had caused a huge surge in building in Hudson during this era. A new post office was constructed, and he added the clock tower at that time to the public green as his gift to Hudson. So this was a dramatic turnaround from the late 1900s to have Ellsworth come home again and invest in his hometown of Hudson. So turning to the areas of houses within the boundary increase, during the Ellsworth years of 1907 and 1925, I've just put some of the houses up on the screen. At the top row, we found a wonderful collection of 1950 photos of houses in this area. And at the bottom of the screen is what those houses look like today. So these 2 houses are 1908. So this is just as Ellsworth is coming into town. And they look remarkably the same. You often see a little bit of a porch alteration, but you really see that those houses have retained the elements, some of the original elements of the houses. Here we have houses again. The top row are 1950 photos of these houses, and the bottom row is what they look like currently. And they're very similar. You see front gable houses, which are quite simple. Front gable houses, quite popular. And interesting with the kind of the raised roof at the 129 Elm Street. So these houses were a little bit later, 1913 to 1920. And here we're moving into the early 1920s. You start to see the bungalow. You've got some wonderful bungalows in this particular neighborhood. And that's what's so interesting. We find that the 1950 photos, there were not a lot of alterations to houses by 1950. You start to see, in this particular case, you start to see the alterations maybe later on, but it's very interesting to see that comparison. So then Ellsworth passed away in 1925, and the town continues to carry on the legacy of Ellsworth. This concept of exurbia is defined by, it actually translates as not suburban. So residential suburbs were beginning to appear in this time. Suburb is defined as really a geographic area, usually located just outside a central city area, usually connected by streetcars. We see streetcar connections linking people into the city center, but living in these residential suburbs just outside of the city. They're usually developed according to a plan. and there's a significant amount of concentration and linkage between the facilities and the dwellings that are in these suburbs. So what's interesting about Hudson is it retained its non-suburban character, really independent of these metropolitan areas that were booming in Akron and Cleveland. It really, through the 1950s, when you had all that mid-century post-World War II investment, Hudson hung on and retained that independent village character. And again, that colonial style influence was throughout the buildings that you saw being constructed. So by 1920s, Hudson saw a totally refreshed expansion and development on Elm, and Roslyn then entered where it connected at the east end of Elm. Roslyn was the connector to the main thoroughfare of Streetsboro. So the first houses you see on Roslyn were in 1925. Again, these were some houses that were built between this screen 1928, top row is those 1950 photos, bottom row is what those homes look like today. You can see some of the classical features, colonial revival features. You see the columns in the front of the building, the multi-pane windows, the broken pediment, but you also see the bungalow is still going strong. Wonderful bungalows in this area as well. 1928 and 29, other wonderful houses. This is on the right, the only Tudor Revival cottage that we came across, which was another interesting little house that entered into the neighborhood. Wonderful little house. So this was really interesting. This is one of the things that was really unusual for us, is usually during the Depression, you see a total stop in construction, especially residential construction going on. And maybe it was the surge from Ellsworth, you know, we don't really know, but there was an unusual amount of construction in the 1930s in this area. So here are two examples. You see that, especially in the lower right-hand corner, again, that colonial revival style influence. And again, several more Depression era homes, 1933 and 1940 on the ends of the screen. And in the center, this is what we would usually expect to see, is that there was an earlier building on the site that we think was part of perhaps a tannery or some very small commercial enterprise. And in 1940, it was altered for residential use. And that's what you'll usually see, a very practical or utilitarian approach in the Depression era, where people are trying to make do with what they have, or recycle, you know, existing buildings for new uses. So that's that center building at 164 Elm Street, the center building on the screen. That's usually what we see, but what was unusual, we saw a lot of new construction in this particular neighborhood during the Depression. Post-World War II, mid-century, very typical construction of that era. Here's a couple photos, houses 1948, 1950. The houses look very much similar today. And then finally, we get into the minimal traditional, which was coming on in the 1950s. And these are two very good examples of that on Elm Street that are part of the district. So this was a wonderful part of working on the district and how we wrapped it up. What this boundary increase allowed us to do was to tell that story of Hudson and bring some of this history together by talking about the establishment of Hudson Heritage and the Architecture Review Board, and really preservation in Hudson. So in the 1960s, suddenly Hudson became proactive in their approach to protecting the character and James Ellsworth's legacy, the character of the buildings in the village. In 1962, this Brewster Store building at 5 Aurora Street, right at the corner of Main and Aurora, was threatened with demolition by the First National Bank of Akron. They wanted to take the bank building down, which is what was going on in the 60s, and make drive-in access and, comfortable for the automobile and for customers coming to the bank was threatened with demolition. At that time, the residents recognized this as the oldest commercial brick edifice in constant use in the Western Reserve. And this small community collected 800 signatures and sent them to the bank, asking them to preserve this building. In 1962, the community wrote, "The destruction of this splendid old building would detract seriously from the quality that makes Hudson something more than a commonplace village." They brought out founder David Hudson's great-great-granddaughter, who wrote to the bank officials and said, "Hudson is no recent development. It has taken almost 200 years to acquire its beauty and stature." So the photo on the screen was a historic image that Hudson Heritage, that was from their site that they had posted, of that beautiful federal style building, which remains today. So in their continued fight in 1962, Peninsula was having a similar situation. So in 1962, representatives from Hudson and Peninsula headed to Washington, D.C. They took a reporter with them from the Akron Beacon Journal. They talked to their Congressman Ayers, and they met with the National Trust for Historic Preservation and the National Park Service, who both agreed to assess the historic value of these sites in Peninsula and Hudson. And on June 17, 1962, after a 2-day study of the communities presented by the National Trust and the National Park Service, Hudson Heritage Association was formally organized, listing 5 goals for the organization. Number 1, to urge the preservation of buildings that are fine or interesting examples of architecture. Number 2, to enforce zoning laws and building codes that encourage the same good taste that Hudson's founders brought with them from Connecticut. The 3rd was to promote maintenance of the village green as a central feature of the village and township. 4, to continue to encourage preservation and the planting of trees, which has always been important to Hudson. And then finally, to cooperate with other communities who were devoted to this goal of continuing development of a well-integrated community, keeping with the traditions of the Western Reserve of Connecticut. So as we know, the Brewster store was saved from demolition. And to put some context on this, as Mary was mentioning, the National Historic Preservation Act was not passed until 1966. This was going on in 1962 in Hudson. And then it's my understanding with the advocacy of Hudson Heritage as well, the Historic Board of Review was established the following year. So really those 2 institutions or those 2 commissions institutionalized this legacy of James Ellsworth and the preservation of the historic character of Hudson with the formation of Hudson Heritage and the Architectural and Historic Board of Review, which are still very strongly active in the community today. So that was the story of Hudson, really in the preservation story, but the boundary increase in Elm and Roslyn really allow us to tell that story and make it part of a National Register, a historic district story. So it was a wonderful experience for us as preservationists to be able to revisit that story that we were familiar with. So that's the story of the boundary increase, and that's why the period of significance ends in 1963 with the formation of those organizations in Hudson. So just to touch again, Mary had done the timeline, but we started this process with submittal of the National Register nomination in April of this year. We worked with a revised draft July 27th. Today we're doing the public meeting, and Friday, December 3rd is going to be the review meeting in Columbus. Mary posted the registration information if you're interested in attending. And again, any objections that you have to the district can be sent as a written and notarized letter to Bert Logan, who is head of the Ohio History Center. But as far as the OSHBAB meeting goes, we anticipate they will recommend that this district boundary increase for approval. And once that happens, SHPO and Diana and I do perhaps a few more edits. The nomination is sent off to NPS, and then within about 3 to 4 months, we'd anticipate the district boundary increase being listed. So maybe by next March. So anyway, that's what I had to present this evening. And again, I'll turn to Tina to see if we have any questions.
No questions, Wendy.
No questions. All right. Well, as Mary pointed out, if you think of something later on, you can certainly reach out to us. I know Nick Sugar is from the city, is lurking in the background. You can always reach out to Nick at the city. He and Greg have been working on this project for a while now, and we're just excited to keep things moving forward. So thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Wendy, for the presentation, and to both you and Diana for all of your work on this nomination. It has been an interesting process to watch Hudson's history march through time with this amendment, and thanks to the city for the sponsorship and all the support. So I think that's our presentation for the evening. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to the State Historic Preservation Office or get in touch with Wendy and Diana or the city. We'll all be happy to help you. And remember to register for the December 3rd OSHBAB meeting. And with that, have a good night. Thank you for coming. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Mary, I just want to mention one last thing to all
Yes,
those who are
Tina.
here, that they can find a recording of tonight's meeting on our website at www.ohiohistory.org/OHSPAB, and it will be posted in a day or two and be available until the meeting on December the 3rd.
Great, Tina. Thank you very much.